Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from a viewer, thanks to Zechariah for this one. Amy plays a Brothers Yamazaki, and Nick plays a Humble against it. After that, Amy plays a second Brothers Yamazaki. What are the stats of each creature? Okay, so the first thing that I want to notice is the middle ability on Brothers Yamazaki. So if we take a look at that, it says that as long as there are exactly two permanents named Brothers Yamazaki, then the legend rule will not apply to them. Of course, the Brothers Yamazaki that got humbled is not going to have this ability anymore. However, the other one still will. And that's good because that means when the game goes to check for any state-based actions, it's going to see that there still is at least one thing on the battlefield that still has the ability that says the legend rule will not apply to those two creatures. And so that means they'll be able to coexist peacefully on the battlefield just like they normally would be able to. We'll note that if this question involved a humility rather than a humble, then this would be a little bit different. The humility takes away all the abilities from both creatures. And so that means that there would not be anything saying the legend rule works different from the way that it normally does. And so that means that when the game checks to see if there's any state-based actions, Amy would have to put one of them in the graveyard. That's the reason why I chose humble for this question instead of humility. Now, let's turn our attention to the last ability on Brothers Yamazaki, the one that buffs other creatures named Brothers Yamazaki. Now, we'll take a look at this one and we'll see that it gives a couple of continuous effects to buff the other Brothers Yamazaki. Now, Humble also generates a couple of continuous effects that act on the permanent that it targeted. So, if you know anything about how continuous effects work, you know the first step is going to be to decide what layer each of these applies in. And so ability adding and removing, that happens in layer 6. So that would be when the loses all abilities from Humble and the gains haste from Brothers Yamazaki would want to apply. Power and toughness changing abilities would apply in layer 7. So that's when the Humble would set the base power and toughness to 0-1, and that's when the Brothers Yamazaki would be given +2/+2. Now that we've got that sorted out, let's take a look and decide what order these apply within each layer. So in layer 6, let's take a look at the Brothers Yamazaki that got targeted by the Humble. We'll notice that if we apply Humble's lose all abilities before we apply that Brothers Yamazaki's grant haste ability, then that's going to cause that Brothers Yamazaki to lose all of its abilities, including the one that generates the continuous effect that we want to apply. Because of this, we can say that that Brothers Yamazaki's ability is dependent on the Humble and it's going to be applied after the Humble, even though it has an earlier timestamp. So that would mean that the first thing that applies in layer 6 would be Humble, and it's going to take away all abilities from that Brothers Yamazaki. Then that Brothers Yamazaki is not going to have any continuous effects to contribute, and then the other Brothers Yamazaki, the one that did not get targeted by Humble, is going to apply, and it's going to grant haste to the brother that did get targeted by the Humble. Kind of weird that the one that got humbled actually is the one that ends up with the ability, but I guess that's how it works. Okay. Now we're ready to move on to layer 7, and we'll take a look here. Humble is going to apply first again this time, but it's for a different reason. That's because power and toughness changing continuous effects are broken up into sub-layers based on how they're changing the power and toughness. It so happens that continuous effects that set the base power and toughness, such as Humble, apply in an earlier sub-layer than continuous effects that modify the power and toughness with a +X or a -X, the way the Brothers Yamazaki ability does. Therefore, we can say that the first thing that happens in layer 7 is Humble setting the base power and toughness of that Brothers Yamazaki to 0-1. And after that, the other Brothers Yamazaki is going to be giving +2/+2 to that one. The humbled Brothers Yamazaki will of course not be giving +2/+2 to anything because it lost the ability to do that in the previous layer. So again, we end up with this kind of weird situation where the Brothers Yamazaki that got humbled is going to actually end up being bigger than the other one because it's getting a buff, whereas it's not giving a buff also. So that's the answer to the question from our original problem statement. The Brothers Yamazaki that got targeted by Humble will be a 2/3 that has haste but not bushido, and the other Brothers Yamazaki will be a 2/1 that has bushido but not haste, and they both will be able to live on the battlefield at the same time because one of the Brothers Yamazaki still does have the ability that lets them do that. Okay, so before I close out, there was one other variation of this situation that I wanted to look at. As originally suggested to me, this question involved Kenrith's transformation rather than Humble. And so this works exactly the same way as the situation that I already described. The only difference is that Kenrith's transformation also changes the color and the creature type, and it makes it a 3/3 instead of being a 0/1, but all of the continuous effect stuff and all the order that they apply, all of that stuff works exactly the same way. However, if we take a look at this card here, Witness Protection, we'll notice something extremely interesting. Unlike the Kenneth's transformation and the humble, this one actually changes the name of the permanent that it affects, and that's going to radically change what the outcome is. So let's take a look at the situation that we just talked about, except instead of humble, Nick is going to play a witness protection against that first Brothers Yamazaki. Okay, so just like in the previous scenario, the Brothers Yamazaki that got enchanted by the witness protection is not going to be able to give any buffs at all. And that's going to be for the exact same reason. There's going to be a dependency, and so that means that even though its grants haste ability has an earlier timestamp, it's going to be getting taken away by the witness protection. However, unlike in the previous scenario that we talked about, that permanent will also not be receiving any buffs, because if we take a look at how Brothers Yamazaki's ability is worded, it specifically looks for other creatures named Brothers Yamazaki to be giving a buff to, because this creature got its name changed to legitimate business person in layer 3 before any of the continuous effects from Brothers Yamazaki are going to get to apply. That means that it's not going to be getting any buffs at all. So basically, the situation is going to be exactly the same as if Amy had one Brothers Yamazaki and one random grizzly bear type creature that didn't have any abilities. Probably exactly the same as what you would probably expect. However, there is one other kind of cool thing about this situation, which is that Amy only controls one permanent named Brothers Yamazaki in this case, which means that she would be able to play a third Brothers Yamazaki onto the battlefield. If she did that, then she would indeed control exactly 2 permanents that were named Brothers Yamazaki, and that means that she would be able to have all 3 of them on the battlefield as normal. And the way that this would shake out would be that each of the Brothers Yamazaki that were actually named as such would be buffing the other one. However, the legitimate business person would not be getting or receiving any buffs from anybody. Now, I guess while I brought that situation up, I should also mention that since some people are probably going to be curious about it, if the witness protection were destroyed or left the battlefield somehow, then Amy would in fact no longer control exactly 2 permanents named Brothers Yamazaki. And so that means that the legend rule would apply to all of them the same way that it normally would. In other words, Amy would have to pick one of them that would get to stay on the battlefield, and the others would be headed to her graveyard. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.